The men left trails of blood in the snow. Not from battle wounds, but from bare feet torn open by frozen ground and jagged ice. They shuffled east through New Jersey like wraiths, hunched against the wind, their faces hollow with hunger, and something worse than hunger, the knowledge that they were losing. Washington rode among them in silence. What could he say? The forts had fallen, New York was lost, Long Island had been a catastrophe, and every engagement since had been a slow retreat, punctuated by small humiliations. The British had pushed them across rivers and through towns where loyalists jeered from doorways, where patriot sympathizers lowered their eyes and said nothing. Each morning brought new deserters. Men slipped away in the darkness, heading for farms and families they should never have left. Washington could not blame them. He had promised them a cause worth dying for, but all they had found was cold and hunger and the endless, grinding certainty of defeat. The Continental Army was dissolving like salt in rain. Behind them, across the river they had just crossed, campfires bloomed in the winter dusk. The British were coming, but slowly, without urgency. Why hurry? The rebels were finished. Everyone knew it. The Redcoats knew it. The Hessians knew it. And worst of all, Washington's own men knew it. They had stopped looking at him when he rode past. December was a graveyard month. Men coughed blood into their hands and kept walking because stopping meant freezing. They had no tents, no blankets worth the name, no shoes. Some wrapped their feet in burlap sacks, others simply walked until their feet went numb and they could no longer feel the damage being done. The Delaware River lay ahead like a promise and a barrier both. Once they crossed it, they would be in Pennsylvania, separated from the enemy by dark water and winter ice. But what then? The enlistments would expire at year's end. In 30 days, most of these men would be legally free to go home. And they would go. Washington knew this with the certainty of a man watching sand run through his fingers. He had led them to this. Every decision, every retreat, every lost battle, it all pointed back to him. He was the general who could not win, leading an army that could not fight, in defense of a nation that did not yet exist and might never exist. The Declaration of Independence, signed just months ago with such hope and fire, now seemed like a child's fantasy, words on paper that meant nothing when measured against British steel and Hessian discipline. The Pennsylvania State House felt colder inside than out. Congress had gathered in emergency session, and the air smelled of fear masked as practicality. Men spoke in low voices about moving the government south, to Baltimore perhaps, somewhere the British couldn't reach before spring. John Hancock sat at the head table, his famous signature on the Declaration now feeling less like defiance and more like evidence for a treason trial. He watched the delegates argue and saw the fractures spreading. Some wanted to negotiate, others wanted to flee. None spoke of victory anymore. Benjamin Franklin sat silent in the corner, wrapped in blankets, his gout flaring in the cold. He had joked once that they must all hang together, or surely they would all hang separately. The joke felt prophetic now. He thought of the gallows the British would erect, the trials that would be brief and brutal. They had signed their names to revolution, and now revolution was dying in the snow. A messenger arrived with news from New Jersey. Washington had crossed the Delaware. The army was intact, barely, but the British were establishing winter quarters at Trenton, at Princeton, at Brunswick, a chain of posts that would hold New Jersey in an iron grip until spring, when Howe would march on Philadelphia and end this rebellion once and for all. Samuel Adams stood to speak, his voice cracking with age and passion. He reminded them of what they had declared, of the self-evident truths they had proclaimed to the world. But his words fell flat in the cold room. Truth was not self-evident when you were losing. Liberty was not unalienable when an army was dissolving. The pursuit of happiness seemed almost obscene when men were freezing to death in service of a failing cause. They voted to adjourn to Baltimore. It was not called a retreat. They used words like strategic and temporary, but everyone knew what it meant. The capital of a nation that barely existed was running away from the nation that actually did exist, the one with ships and cannons and the world's greatest army. Franklin rose painfully to leave, and someone asked him if he still believed they would prevail. He looked around the emptying room, at the chairs being stacked, at the maps being rolled up and packed away. "We have put our hands to the plough," he said quietly, "and we cannot turn back now." But his eyes said something different. His eyes said they might already have turned back without knowing it, that they might already be finished. Outside, snow began to fall on the city where independence had been declared. Somewhere across the river, Washington was making camp with an army of ghosts, and the British were settling into warm quarters, and the revolution was becoming a memory before it had even properly begun. Washington sat alone in his tent and read the letters by candlelight. They came from officers, from civilians, from members of Congress, all asking the same question in different words. What will you do? As if he had answers, as if there were answers to be had. He was 44 years old and had never felt older. His face in the small mirror showed a man worn down by failure, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, jaw tight with the effort of maintaining composure. He had been a planter, a surveyor, a provincial colonel who had seen the British fight. He had never wanted this command, had never wanted any of this. The battles played in his mind like a recurring nightmare. Long Island, where he had been outflanked and nearly trapped. White Plains, where he had been pushed back. Fort Washington, where he had lost nearly 3,000 men in a single day, the largest disaster of the war. Fort Lee, abandoned so quickly they left tents standing and supplies stacked. Every engagement a retreat. Every retreat another blow to already shattered morale. His officers came to him with problems he could not solve. Men without shoes, men without food, men without the will to continue. They asked for supplies that did not exist, reinforcements that would not come, strategies that might work if only they had an army instead of this collection of farmers and tradesmen who flinched at artillery and broke under bayonet charges. He had written to Congress begging for support, for regular troops, for anything. Their responses were full of sympathy and empty of substance. They had no money. The states would not cooperate. Militias came and went as they pleased. The Continental Army was a fiction, sustained only by his presence and his reputation, and both were crumbling. At night he dreamed of Mount Vernon, of his fields and his home, of a life he had left behind to lead men to their deaths in a cause that now seemed hopeless. He could resign, hand over command to someone else, let them try to make something from these ruins, go home with what remained of his honor and let history judge him a failure. But who would he give command to? Greene was capable but exhausted. Sullivan had been captured and exchanged and seemed hollowed out by the experience. Knox was brilliant with artillery, but no field commander. There was no one else. And if he resigned, the army would dissolve completely within days. His presence was the only thing holding it together, and even that was not enough. He extinguished the candle and sat in darkness, listening to the wind tear at the canvas walls. Somewhere in this camp were men who still believed in him, though he could not fathom why. Men who had followed him through defeat after defeat, and somehow still looked to him for salvation. He owed them more than this endless retreat. He owed them a victory, or at least an honourable end, but he had no idea how to give them either. Colonel Johann Rohl sat by the fire in his commandeered house in Trenton and dealt cards for another game. Outside, his Hessian soldiers settled into winter quarters with the relief of men who knew their work was done. The rebels were broken. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. The house was warm, requisitioned from a loyalist merchant who was only too happy to accommodate the colonel and his officers. They had food, wine, and comfortable beds. They had braziers and blankets, and the certainty that comes from serving the winning side. Across the river, Washington's rabble was freezing in the woods. Here, civilization prevailed. Rohl's officers were in high spirits. They had marched through New Jersey like conquerors because that was what they were. The rebels had not stood and fought, not once. They had run, and kept running, until they had nowhere left to run but across the river into Pennsylvania. Good riddance. Let them freeze there. while proper soldiers enjoyed proper quarters. Some of the junior officers suggested patrols, fortifications, pickets posted at the edge of town. Rawle waved them away with his wineglass. Patrols for what? To guard against farmers with squirrel guns? The rebels could barely march, let alone mount an attack. And in this weather? Impossible. No army moved in winter. It was not done. The season itself was protection enough. The Hessians had a reputation to maintain. They were professional soldiers, mercenaries in the best sense of the word, men who had fought across Europe and won. These colonials were not soldiers. They were peasants playing at war, and they had learned the cost of their presumption. New York was British. New Jersey was British. Soon Philadelphia would be British, and that would be the end of it. Christmas came with celebration. The men drank rum and sang songs from home, songs about mountains and villages they would return to as victors. They roasted meat over fires and toasted King George and spoke of the prize money that would come when the war officially ended. Some of them felt almost sorry for the rebels, who had nothing but cold and hunger and the knowledge of defeat. Rawle posted minimal guards and told his men to rest. They had earned it. They had chased Washington across half of New Jersey without losing a single major engagement. The Continental Army was dissolving on its own. Why waste energy on an enemy that was already dead? Winter was their garrison now, better than any wall or fortress. Late on Christmas night, a local farmer came to warn of rebel movement across the river. Rawle sent him away. Probably deserters, he said, or foragers looking for food. Nothing to concern professional soldiers. He returned to his cards and his wine, and outside the snow began to fall harder, covering the tracks of men who were no longer content to simply freeze and die. Christmas Eve found Washington standing on the Pennsylvania shore, staring across the black water at New Jersey. Ice floes drifted past like broken pieces of something that had once been whole. Behind him, his army huddled in whatever shelter they could find, waiting for orders or for death, whichever came first. He had gathered his officers earlier, the ones he trusted most. Greene, Knox, Sullivan, Monroe. They had looked at him with hollowed eyes, waiting to hear what impossible thing he would ask of them now. He had spread the map on a table and shown them Trenton, showed them where the Hessians were quartered, warm and drunk, and certain of their superiority. The plan was madness. Everyone knew it. Cross an ice-choked river in the dead of winter, march 9 miles in darkness and storm, attack a professional garrison at dawn. With an army that was starving and barefoot, with men who had never won a battle, whose enlistments expired in a week, it was suicide dressed up as strategy. But Washington had done the mathematics of despair. In 7 days, most of his army would legally cease to exist. Men would go home because they had every right to go home, because they had served their time and gotten nothing for it but suffering. If he did nothing, the Continental Army would dissolve on its own, and with it any hope of independence. The revolution would end not with a battle but with a whimper, men simply walking away from a dream that had turned into nightmare. He needed something impossible, a victory, and not just any victory, a dramatic one, unexpected, stunning, something that would make men believe again, something that would make them stay. And he needed it now, before winter finished what the British had started. The password would be victory or death. He chose it himself, wrote it in his own hand. No middle ground, no retreat this time. They would cross the river and attack, and either win or die trying, because anything else was already a kind of death, a slow dissolution into nothing. Knox came to him as night fell, his bulk silhouetted against the campfires. "The men are ready," he said, though both of them knew this was only partly true. Some men were ready. Others were simply out of choices. The boats were being assembled, Durham boats, big flat-bottomed vessels meant for hauling ore and grain, now pressed into service for a desperate gamble. Washington turned back to the river. Somewhere across that black water was either salvation or oblivion, and he would not know which until it was too late to turn back. But doing nothing was also a choice, and it led only to certain defeat. At least this way they would go down fighting. At least this way they would choose their own end. He gave the order to begin loading the boats. Behind him, men rose from fires and began their slow shuffle toward the shore. The order passed from officer to officer in whispers, spreading through the camp like a secret that could not be kept. Victory or death. Men repeated it to each other in the darkness, testing the weight of the words. It was not a rallying cry. It was a plain statement of fact. They assembled at the river's edge in the late afternoon, 2,400 men who looked more like refugees than soldiers. Some had wrapped their feet in rags or burlap. Others had actual shoes, a luxury that marked them as lucky or recently arrived. All of them were gaunt, their faces sharp with hunger and cold, but something had changed in their eyes. Word had spread about the plan. Trenton, a surprise attack, a chance to hit back instead of running. Men who had been talking about desertion now talked about the Hessians, about the warm quarters they occupied, about the supplies they had taken. Resentment was a kind of fuel, and Washington was learning to burn it. The Durham boats waited, black shapes against the darkening water. They were 40 feet long, built to carry ore down the Delaware to Philadelphia, now commandeered for war. Oarsmen checked their equipment, wrapping cloth around the oarlocks to muffle sound. Artillery pieces were positioned near the shore. Knox's guns, 18 of them, from small field pieces to heavy cannon. Getting them across would be a nightmare. Officers moved among the men, checking equipment, distributing ammunition. 40 rounds per man, those who had working muskets. Some carried weapons taken from dead soldiers, British or American. It made no difference now. Others had hunting rifles, accurate but slow to reload. A few had nothing but their fists and the promise of taking a weapon from the enemy. Washington mounted his horse and rode along the line. He did not make a speech. There were no words that could make this less desperate or more certain. He simply looked at them, and they looked back, and in that exchange was a kind of covenant. He was asking them to risk everything on a single throw. They were agreeing because they had nothing left to lose. As darkness fell completely, the loading began. Men stepped into the boats carefully, finding their balance on the wet planks. The boats rocked and water sloshed over the sides. Ice scraped against wood. The horses whinnied nervously, sensing the tension in their handlers. Artillery pieces were manhandled onto the larger boats, men straining under the weight. Knox directed the loading with quiet efficiency, his voice carrying across the water in urgent whispers. Each boat had to be balanced perfectly, or it would capsize. Too much weight in the bow and the front would dip under. Too much in the stern and steering became impossible. Men shifted and reshuffled until each vessel sat low but stable in the black water. The first boats pushed off into the current, oars dipped and pulled, and the men inside became silhouettes, then shadows, then nothing at all. More boats followed. The crossing had begun, victory or death. There would be no other outcome. Now. The storm came as they reached the middle of the river, as if nature itself had been waiting to deliver one final test. Wind howled across the water, whipping up waves that had no business existing on a river. Sleet fell in sheets, turning the world into a chaos of ice and darkness. The oarsmen bent to their work, pulling against the current and the wind both. Ice floes the size of dinner tables drifted downstream, slamming into boats with sounds like axe blows. Men used oars and rifle butts to push the ice away, but more kept coming, an endless procession of frozen threats that could hole a boat and send everyone in it to the bottom. Washington stood in the lead boat, one hand gripping the side, the other steadying his horse. The animal's eyes were white with fear, but it stood somehow, hooves planted wide, trusting its master even as the boat pitched and rolled. Around them, other boats appeared and disappeared in the storm, glimpses of desperate motion in the sleet and spray. Knox's artillery boats were the worst. The cannon made them heavy and slow, sitting low in the water with only inches of freeboard. Waves broke over the sides, soaking the men and threatening the powder stores. The artillerymen bailed constantly, using their hats, their hands, anything to keep the boats from foundering. One boat nearly capsized when a wave caught it broadside, but the men threw their weight to the high side and somehow kept it upright. The crossing was supposed to take a few hours. It took 9. Boats drifted downstream in the current, missing their landing points, having to row back upstream against wind and ice. Some made it across only to find the bank too steep to climb, forcing them to search in darkness for a place to unload. Men hauled boats onto shore by sheer force, dragging artillery pieces up slopes that seemed designed to prevent exactly this kind of landing. Some men fell into the water and had to be pulled out, their clothes freezing to their bodies before they reached shore. Others collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried. But slowly, boat by boat, man by man, the army crossed. They assembled on the New Jersey shore like pieces of a machine that had been broken and scattered, now coming back together in the darkness. By the time the last boats arrived, it was nearly 4 in the morning. They were 3 hours behind schedule. Dawn was only 2 hours away. There was no time for rest, no time to warm frozen hands or dry wet powder. They had to march immediately if they were to reach Trenton before full daylight, before the advantage of surprise was lost. Washington looked at his officers, saw his own exhaustion reflected in their faces. But there was something else too, a kind of grim determination born from having come this far. They had crossed the river. They were on enemy ground now. There was no going back, even if they wanted to. Victory or death was not just a password anymore. It was their only choice. They marched in 2 columns through a world that seemed designed to kill them. The storm had not abated. Sleet fell sideways, driven by wind that cut through their ragged uniforms like knives. The road was a river of freezing mud that sucked at their feet with every step. 9 miles to Trenton. In good weather, with a fresh army, perhaps 3 hours. Tonight it might as well have been 90. Men stumbled and fell, got up and stumbled again. The column stretched out as the stronger men pulled ahead and the weaker fell behind. Officers moved up and down the line, urging, threatening, pleading. Keep moving, keep together, the Hessians are waiting. Washington rode between the columns, checking their progress. Sullivan's division had taken the river road, closer to the Delaware. Greene's division, including Washington himself, took the inland route. They would converge on Trenton from 2 directions, trapping the Hessians between them. That was the plan. If they both arrived, if the storm did not scatter them, if dawn did not come too soon. Men wrapped rags around their muskets to keep the powder dry, but it was hopeless. The sleet soaked through everything. Cartridge boxes leaked. Powder horns grew damp. They would reach Trenton with weapons that might not fire, facing professional soldiers with dry powder and warm barrels. But there was no choice now. They had committed. Someone collapsed in the road ahead, a dark shape that did not rise. Officers shouted for men to pick him up, carry him, but there were too many falling now. Men simply stepped over the fallen and kept walking. Those who could not keep up would freeze where they lay. It was arithmetic now, brutal and simple. The mission required getting most of the army to Trenton, not every soldier. The sky began to lighten imperceptibly, a gradual shift from black to grey. Dawn was coming, and with it the end of surprise. If the Hessians spotted them approaching, if sentries raised the alarm, the entire attack would collapse. They would be caught in the open by professional soldiers in defensive positions. It would be a slaughter. Knox came riding back along the column, his face red with cold and effort. The artillery was keeping pace, barely. The men were dragging the guns by hand when the horses faltered, throwing ropes over their shoulders and hauling like draft animals. Some of the lighter pieces were being carried, men staggering under the weight of barrels and carriages. Impossible that they had made it this far. More impossible that they would be able to fire when the time came. But they kept moving. 1 foot and then the next, 1 yard and then another. The storm hid them, even as it tried to kill them. If they could just reach the outskirts of Trenton before full light, if they could just get close enough to attack before being spotted, they might have a chance. Not a good chance, but a chance. Washington checked his watch by lightning flash. Past 7. The sun would be up soon. They should have attacked an hour ago. But the storm had slowed everything. the crossing, the march, reality itself seeming to drag its feet. He gave the order to increase pace. Men who could barely walk were asked to run. Somehow, incredibly, they did. The first shots came from the pickets at the edge of town, Hessian sentries firing into the storm at shadows that resolved into men. The alarm bells rang, their sound flat and strange in the heavy air. But by then, the Americans were already in the streets, appearing from the grey dawn like vengeful ghosts. Washington rode at the front, his height and bearing unmistakable even in the storm. Knox's artillery unlocked and deployed with a speed born from desperate practice. The first cannon fired, the sound enormous in the narrow streets, and grape-shot tore through the Hessian ranks as they tumbled from their quarters, half-dressed and confused. The Hessians tried to form up, their training asserting itself even through shock and hangover. Officers shouted commands in German, trying to organize a defense. Some men still had their weapons. Others grabbed whatever they could find, but they were scattered through the town, in houses and barns, separated and surrounded. Colonel Rawle stumbled into the street, pulling on his coat, trying to understand what was happening. Rebels? Here? In winter? In this storm? It was impossible. But the cannon fire was very real, and his men were dying in the streets. He shouted for a counterattack, tried to rally his troops for a bayonet charge that might break through the American lines. But there were no American lines. There were Americans everywhere. Sullivan's column had come down the river road exactly as planned, sealing off the southern escape. Greene's men poured in from the north. The Hessians found themselves in a closing vice with American soldiers on every side and American artillery commanding every street. Some of the Hessians tried to fight. They fired volleys that went wild in the storm, then charged with bayonets. But the Americans did not break this time. They stood and returned fire, and when their muskets misfired in the wet, they used them as clubs. Men grappled in the streets, fighting with fists and knives and desperation. Washington was everywhere, riding through the gunsmoke, shouting encouragement. "Advance! Press them! Give them no room!" His officers echoed the commands, and the army that had spent months retreating suddenly remembered how to attack. They moved forward, building by building, clearing houses, capturing prisoners, seizing weapons and supplies. Rawle tried to organize a retreat to the south, but Sullivan's men blocked the way. He tried to break through to the north, but Greene's artillery was waiting. His soldiers began to surrender in groups, throwing down their weapons, raising their hands. Some tried to flee into the countryside but were run down by American cavalry that appeared from nowhere. In less than an hour, it was over. Rawle lay dying in the street, shot twice, his uniform soaked with blood and rain. Around him, his men sat in clusters under guard. Professional soldiers who had been beaten by farmers and tradesmen in a surprise attack they never thought possible. The impossible had happened. The Americans had won. The silence after battle was almost deafening. Gun smoke drifted through the streets of Trenton, mixing with sleet and fog. American soldiers moved through the town in a daze, barely believing what they had done. They had won. For the first time since Long Island, since the war began, they had actually won. The count came in slowly. Nearly 900 Hessian prisoners, more than the Americans had dared hope. 4 brass cannon captured. Thousands of muskets, tons of ammunition, supplies enough to sustain the army for weeks, and casualties theirs, not ours. 2 Americans dead, 4 wounded. The disparity was almost impossible to believe. Knox oversaw the organization of the captured supplies, his face split in a grin that would not fade. Barrels of flour, salt, pork, rum, blankets, and coats. Shoes, blessed shoes that fit feet that had been bare for weeks. Men tried on Hessian boots and laughed like children, the sound strange and wonderful after so much silence and defeat. Washington walked through the town, seeing his soldiers transformed. Men who had been shuffling corpses yesterday now stood straight. They looked at him differently, not with the hollow eyes of the defeated, but with something like pride. They had crossed an ice-choked river in a storm. They had marched 9 miles through sleet. They had attacked professional soldiers and won. They were not farmers playing at war anymore. They were an army. The prisoners were assembled in the town square, guarded but treated well. Some of them looked relieved to be captured. The war was over for them, and they would not have to face another winter campaign. Others looked shocked, unable to process how they had been beaten by rebels they had dismissed as rabble. Colonel Rawl died that afternoon, apologizing to his men for his failure to take the American threat seriously. Word began to spread even before the army recrossed the Delaware. Farmers who had watched the Americans retreat just days ago now saw them returning with prisoners and captured supplies. The news would travel fast to Philadelphia, to the other colonies, to Congress huddling in Baltimore. Washington had struck back. The Continental Army still existed. The Revolution was not dead. But Washington knew this was only the beginning. One victory did not win a war. The British still held New York, still had overwhelming force. Cornwallis would be coming with reinforcements, angry and determined to avenge this humiliation. They had won a battle, an important battle, but the war stretched ahead like a long, dark road with no end in sight. Still, for this moment, in this town, surrounded by exhausted men who had done the impossible, Washington allowed himself to feel something like hope. They had proven they could win. They had proven the British were not invincible. They had given themselves and their cause a reason to continue. The tide had not fully turned, not yet, but it had shifted. The river flowed differently now. The news reached Philadelphia like lightning through dry timber. Washington had crossed the Delaware. Washington had attacked Trenton. Washington had won. Men who had been preparing to flee stood frozen, barely daring to believe. Congress received the dispatch and read it 3 times, searching for qualifications or hedges that were not there. It was a clear victory, total and undeniable. In taverns and homes, in shops and churches, the story spread and grew. Each telling added details: the storm, the crossing, the surprise at dawn. Men who had been silent about their patriot sympathies now spoke openly. Loyalists who had been confident just days ago now looked uncertain. The British were not invincible after all. The rebellion was not finished. At the army's camp, the transformation was even more dramatic. Men whose enlistments were due to expire in days now hesitated. Some still left, their time served, their duty fulfilled. But others stayed. And new men arrived: militia from Pennsylvania, farmers from New Jersey, young men who heard about Trenton and wanted to be part of something that was suddenly alive again. Washington offered a bounty to those who would extend their enlistments: $10, a fortune for men who had been fighting for nothing but a cause. It was not enough by itself. Money never was. But combined with victory, with the memory of Hessian prisoners marching in defeat, it was enough to make men reconsider. The army that should have dissolved at year's end held together. Recruiting stations that had been empty for months suddenly had lines. Boys lied about their age to enlist. Tradesmen left their shops. Farmers left their fields, even though it was winter and they should have been home. The story of Trenton did what no amount of propaganda or speeches could do. It made men believe that victory was possible, that their sacrifice might mean something. Officers who had been managing desertion now managed enlistment. They took names and handed out muskets and tried to turn enthusiasm into discipline. The new men were raw, untrained, but they had something the veterans had lost and found again: hope. They believed they were joining an army that could win. In camp, the veterans told and retold the story of the crossing, of the march, of the attack at dawn. Each telling polished it a bit more, added details, removed doubts. It became legend even as it was happening, a story they would tell their children and grandchildren. We were there. We crossed the Delaware with Washington. We surprised the Hessians at Trenton. We won. The supplies captured at Trenton kept them fed and equipped through the worst of winter. The Hessian muskets were better than what most of the men had been carrying. The coats and blankets saved lives, but more valuable than any material gain was the intangible thing that victory had given them: the understanding that they were not doomed to endless defeat. They could fight. They could win. They were an army again. Cornwallis came south with 8,000 men, determined to crush Washington and restore British prestige. He trapped the Continental Army at Trenton with the Delaware at their backs, confident that dawn would bring the rebels' final defeat. But when dawn came, the American campfires still burned, and the army was gone. Washington had done it again, slipped away in darkness, marching around the British flank toward Princeton. It was audacity bordering on madness, the same kind of calculated desperation that had produced Trenton. But this time there was a difference. The men believed in him now. When he ordered them to march through the night, they marched. Princeton was lightly defended, most of the garrison having marched with Cornwallis. But the British troops there were regulars, not Hessian mercenaries, and they were alert and ready. The Americans attacked at dawn, and the initial assault faltered. Men who had been victorious at Trenton suddenly remembered what it felt like to face professional soldiers in open battle. The line began to waver, then to break. Regiments fell back in confusion. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard over the gunfire. For a terrible moment it looked like all the confidence gained at Trenton would be shattered here, undone by one failed attack. Then Washington rode forward, directly into the gunfire. He positioned himself between the retreating Americans and the advancing British, his horse dancing sideways, his uniform making him an unmistakable target. He did not shout or plead. He simply sat there, perfectly calm, as bullets whipped past him and his aides begged him to move back. The retreating soldiers saw him and stopped. Shame and pride warred on their faces, shame at running, pride that their commander would risk his life for them. They turned around. They reformed their lines. And when Washington pointed his sword at the British positions and said forward, they went forward. The counterattack was fierce and sudden. Americans who had been running moments before now charged with something close to fury. The British, expecting an easy victory, were caught off balance. The battle swung violently, American pressure forcing the British back through the town, through the college grounds, into full retreat. By the time Cornwallis realized what had happened and marched his army back to Princeton, Washington was gone again, moving north toward the mountains. 2 victories in 10 days. The pattern was set. Now the Americans would not stand and fight a set-piece battle where British numbers and discipline would prevail. They would strike and fade, hit and run, keeping the revolution alive through mobility and surprise. In London, the news from Princeton arrived like a physical blow. It was one thing to lose a garrison of Hessians at Trenton. It was another entirely to have British regulars defeated in open battle by colonial rebels. Parliament began asking uncomfortable questions. Military officials started studying maps more carefully. The war they had expected to end by winter was continuing, and the rebels suddenly seemed far more dangerous than anyone had believed. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin read the dispatches from America with tears in his eyes. He had been in France for months, trying to convince the court of Louis XVI to support the American cause. The French had been polite, interested, but non-committal. Revolution was risky business. Why back a losing cause? But Trenton and Princeton changed everything. Suddenly, the Americans were not just rebellious colonists doomed to defeat. They were a military force capable of defeating professional European soldiers. The French ministers leaned forward in their chairs, asked more questions, listened more carefully. An alliance that had seemed impossible now seemed merely difficult. The Spanish court heard the news and reconsidered their position. The Dutch merchants calculated the profit in supplying American rebels. Across Europe, the story spread: Washington's crossing, the surprise attack, the victory against impossible odds. It became romantic, dramatic, the kind of story that captured imaginations. Artists began sketching scenes of the crossing. Poets wrote verses about the frozen river and the barefoot army. In the German states, recruiters for the Hessian regiments found their work suddenly more difficult. Men who had been willing to serve for English gold now hesitated. The Americans were not savages to be easily crushed. They were soldiers who could fight and win. The prospect of serving in America became less attractive, more dangerous. Back in America, the transformation was even more profound. Colonies that had been wavering in their commitment to independence now sent delegates and supplies. State legislatures that had been dragging their feet on raising troops suddenly found the political will to act. The Continental Congress, no longer huddled in Baltimore but returned to Philadelphia, voted funds and support with new enthusiasm. Ordinary people changed too. Farmers who had been waiting to see which side would win now made their choice. They hid Continental soldiers from British patrols. They brought food and supplies to the army. They volunteered information about British movements. The passive population that the British had counted on to stay neutral was becoming actively hostile. In Boston, where the British had evacuated months earlier, church bells rang to celebrate the victories. In Charleston, men toasted Washington's health. In Virginia, recruiting offices were overwhelmed with volunteers. The psychological effect of Trenton and Princeton spread like ripples on a pond, reaching into corners of the country that had never seen a battle. The Declaration of Independence was read aloud again in public squares, but this time the words carried different weight. They were no longer just an aspiration, a hoped-for future. They were a reality being forged in winter storms and dawn attacks, written in frozen footprints and captured Hessian guns. The nation that had been declared in July was being born in December and January, crystallizing around the improbable victories of an army that refused to die. Spring came slowly to Morristown, where Washington had established winter quarters in the hills of New Jersey. The Continental Army had survived another winter, diminished but intact, and the British had pulled back their outposts, consolidating their forces. The war stretched ahead with no end in sight, but it was a different war now. Washington sat alone in his headquarters one evening and thought about the night he had stood by the Delaware, contemplating whether to cross. It felt like years ago rather than months. He had been a different man then, worn down by defeat, questioning everything. The decision to attack Trenton had not felt like genius at the time. It had felt like desperation. But that decision, made in darkness and doubt, had changed the entire trajectory of the war. One attack, one victory, had done what no amount of political maneuvering or foreign diplomacy could have done. It had given people faith. Not just faith in him, though there was that too. Faith in the possibility of success. Faith that independence was achievable, not just desirable. He thought about the men who had crossed the river with him, who had marched through that storm. Many of them were dead now, killed in subsequent battles or lost to disease and winter. Others had gone home, their service completed. But what they had done at Trenton lived on, growing larger than the actual events, becoming the story that the revolution needed. The irony was not lost on him. The British had nearly won the war without fighting. Their strategy of slow attrition, of pushing the Continental Army into gradual dissolution, had been working perfectly. If he had simply done nothing, let the enlistments expire, let the army fade away, the war would have ended. The decision to attack had been the decision to keep fighting, to refuse the inevitability of defeat. And that decision had been a choice in the truest sense, made without certainty of outcome, without guarantee of success. He had looked at terrible options and chosen what seemed like the least terrible. He had risked everything on a single throw because the alternative was losing everything slowly. Now people called him a brilliant strategist, a daring commander. They wrote poems about the crossing, painted pictures of him standing in the boat. But he remembered the reality, the fear, the doubt, the cold certainty that he was probably leading his men to their deaths. The genius everyone praised had felt like gambling in the moment. Yet that was leadership, he understood now. Not having perfect knowledge or making perfect decisions, but making the hard choices when the easy choices led to ruin. Not knowing the future but shaping it through action when inaction meant defeat. The weight of command was not just responsibility for men's lives, but responsibility for possibilities, for futures that might exist if the right choices were made. Outside his window, soldiers drilled in the spring mud. They were not the same soldiers who had fled across New Jersey in December. Some of them were the same men, but they carried themselves differently now. They had tasted victory and found it sustaining. They had learned that the British could be beaten, that the impossible could be achieved. The war would go on for years yet. There would be more defeats, more winters, more desperate choices. But the worst had passed, Washington believed. They had survived the darkest moment. They had crossed their river and found the far shore. The nation that was being born might still fail, might still collapse, but it would not die from loss of faith. Trenton had seen to that. He rose and went to join his officers for the evening meal. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new challenges. But tonight, for this moment, he allowed himself to remember that frozen December night, the sound of ice against the boats, the weight of the decision that had changed everything. One choice, made in desperation, had altered the course of a revolution. That was the terrible and magnificent burden of command, that choices mattered, that decisions made in darkness could shape the light to come. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.